right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Rachel Hoff, the Policy Director here at the Ronald Reagan Institute. Thanks to our distinguished guests who have joined us here in person at the Institute in Washington, and also, of course, to our virtual audience who's joined today online. And thank you to our co-hosts, the National Endowment for Democracy, for helping to organize and convene this important event. Our thanks in particular to NED's Chairman and CEO, Damon Wilson, who will be moderating our esteemed panel following today's film screening. Well, anyone who's had a hand in organizing events like this knows that they're weeks in the making, sometimes even months in the making. But today's event is truly special because it's been years in the making. It was back in 2020 when Vladimir Kara-Murza, who we honor today, first approached the Reagan Institute about hosting a film screening for his latest documentary about a Russian Orthodox priest with a personal connection to President Reagan. Having known and worked with Vladimir for about 10 years at that point, of course, as any of you would have, I jumped at the opportunity. And we were just launching the Institute's newest policy center, our Center for Freedom and Democracy. And so we thought it was a fantastic idea to host an event to highlight a bit of history that was so relevant to our work. But of course, the pandemic had other plans and the event never quite materialized. And then just as in-person events were starting to come back online and we began to think about scheduling the event, the unthinkable happened. As you all know, in April of last year, Vladimir was arrested and imprisoned in Russia. We, of course, assumed that the film screening would be on hold indefinitely, postponed, of course, until Vladimir was safe. But just 1 month later, I received an email that I wasn't expecting, and I will certainly never forget. Vladimir's wife, Evgenia, reached out because Vladimir had asked her to inquire about the status of our film screening. Even in a prison in Russia, Vladimir continued his work. Even as his own freedom was threatened, he remained focused on telling the story of others who fought for freedom. And so while our event today was intended to focus on history about this priest who fought for religious freedom in the Soviet Union, it's now, of course, taken on this contemporary relevance, this tragic contemporary relevance, given Vladimir's imprisonment. History tragically rhymes, and persecution, unfortunately, is alive and well. But Vladimir would probably be the first to say that today's event should not just be about him. He's one of many political prisoners, and not just in Russia. Some estimate there are more than 1 million political prisoners around the world today. Just yesterday, our friends at Freedom House launched a new political prisoners initiative, which highlights 10 individuals imprisoned across every region of the world. These cases may not be as well known as Vladimir Kara-Murza, but they illustrate the global nature and the scale of repression against human rights defenders and democracy activists. We here think this carries on the work of President Reagan, who took it as a personal mission to champion individual cases of political dissidents who were fighting for freedom. That's how President Reagan met Father Edelstein in 1988 during his visit to Moscow. That night, President Reagan shared these words with the human rights defenders he met with in Moscow. Quote, "I came here hoping to do what I could to give you strength. Yet I already know it is you who have strengthened me, you who have given me a message to carry back. While we press for human rights through diplomatic channels, you press with your very lives, day in, day out, year after year, risking your jobs, your home, your all." That was the work of Father Edelstein. That is the work of Vladimir Kara-Murza. It's why we never should have been surprised when he asked for an update about this film screening from his prison cell in Russia. It is his life's work, and it's the work that his wife, Evgenia, so capably carries on. While she may never have asked to be an advocate, she has assumed the role with courage and with grace, inspiring us all. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Evgenia Kara-Murza.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you all so much for coming tonight and for giving me this amazing opportunity to share with you a story told by my husband, Vladimir Kara-Murza, about someone truly inspiring. And of course, I want to thank our hosts tonight, the Reagan Institute and the National Endowment for Democracy, for organizing this event and for welcoming us on these beautiful premises. Rachel, thank you so very much. Thank you very much, Damon. I'm often asked why Vladimir makes the choices he makes. How can a normal person, time and again, face the well-oiled and mean-spirited repressive machine of the Putin regime, knowing very well what it does to those who refuse to back down? Is it naivete or recklessness or maybe some ulterior motive? Well, I believe that Vladimir's documentaries, and he's made 3 so far, answer this question clearly and quite unequivocally. Father Georgy Edelstein is definitely one of those influences in my husband's life that have greatly contributed to him becoming the man he is today, the patriot and the warrior he is today. Vladimir is lucky to have had several such influences in his life, including his own father, Vladimir Kara-Murza Sr., who was one of the first independent journalists in the post-Soviet Russia, Boris Nemtsov, a great Russian statesman and Vladimir's longtime colleague and friend. And of course, Vladimir has always been inspired by the stories of Soviet dissidents, those people who fought the seemingly hopeless fight against the Soviet regime and won. All these people have something very important in common, and that is their integrity. Their integrity and their refusal to back down, to betray their principles when they're faced with repression, with threats. Staying true to oneself is a personal choice that we all make one way or another, but that choice very often defines all other choices that we make in life. This is Vladimir's 3rd documentary, after They Chose Freedom, a film about Soviet dissidents, and Nemtsov. And I believe that by telling these stories, even maybe without realizing it himself, Vladimir wants to share a very important message with his audience, with you. That the fight against the evil, whatever form or shape that evil may take, is never hopeless. And every single one of us can make a difference if we choose to maintain that integrity and choose not to let fear guide our actions. The same choice thousands of Russians have made since last February, when they refused to stay silent in the face of atrocities committed by the Russian state against Ukraine. The courageous stand of these people, however hopeless their struggle might seem today, is the hope, the guarantee, really, that Russia has a future, and that future is very different from the one that Vladimir Putin envisaged for it. Well, I'm here tonight standing before you because of that documentary that Vladimir made and wanted so much to share with you. And I want his voice to be heard here tonight. So I have a little something that he wrote for you. And I'm gonna read it. Dear friends, one of Russia's most respected broadsheet newspapers, Kommersant, where I once had the honor to work, carries a message on its front page that it was founded in 1909, but had to temporarily cease publication between 1917 and 1990. And I quote, for reasons beyond editorial control, end of quote. I am very sorry that for reasons similarly beyond my control, I am unable to join you in person today as I had hoped. But I know that Evgenia will answer any of your questions about the film and beyond, and of course, I will let the documentary speak for itself. This is the story of a remarkable man in a remarkably difficult era. It is a film about true tolerance and true faith, the relationship between Jewishness and Christianity, the collaboration between church leaders and a totalitarian state, and the importance of speaking the truth, no matter the consequences. Father Georgy Edelstein has always defied stereotypes, a distinct anti-communist in a communist society, a defender of freedom who rejects the title of dissident, a village priest in Russia who was restored to his parish by President Reagan and whose son would become an Israeli statesman. As anyone in creative professions knows, it's often difficult to choose a title for your work, something brief, expressive, and reflective of the main idea. In our case, it was easy, and the film practically named itself. Because not staying silent has always been Father Georgy's guiding principle. As he says in the film, if we stay silent, we participate in the evil that is happening in our world. I thought of these words last February when Father Georgy Edelstein became one of the first Russian Orthodox clergymen to publicly voice his opposition to Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine. These words resonate with many of us here in Russia who have refused to stay silent in the face of this atrocity, even at the cost of personal freedom. And if, in today's Russia, that is the price for not being participants in evil, then it's a price worth paying. I want to thank everyone who made this film possible, my crew members across 3 continents, my executive producer Maria Lekoch, without whom this documentary would not exist, and our benefactor Leonid Nevzlin, who suggested the idea for the film and gave us the opportunity to realize it. My unspeakable gratitude goes to my wife Evgenia for all her help and support, and especially now as she has stepped in to continue all my work. Thank you so much to the Reagan Institute and the National Endowment for Democracy for organizing this screening, and in particular to my friends Damon Wilson, Miriam Lanskoy, and Rachel Hoff. And I want to take this opportunity to personally thank every one of you who is here today. I'm sorry not to be with you, but I look forward to joining you here in Washington on many future occasions. As Soviet dissidents like to say, in Russia, the night is always darkest before the dawn. Finally, I would like to say how grateful and fortunate I feel to have met and to know Father Georgy Edelstein, a man of principle, courage, and integrity, a man who considers it his duty to not stay silent. Thank you very much, and please enjoy.
Мне лет 10-11 было. О чем-то говорили, хоть убей, о книге, о фильме, о чем-то говорили. И я ему сказал, пап, ну это же не так, его же заставили. И он вдруг так остановился, посмотрел на меня и говорит, ты запомни, нет такого заставили. Человека нельзя заставить. Человека можно бить, пытать, убивать, а заставить человека нельзя.
Я от нее воспринял очень важную вещь одну. Не надо бояться. Не надо бояться. В своей жизни мы отвечаем только за свою жизнь. Мы отвечаем только за свои дела, за свои мысли и за свои помыслы.
У священника, в общем, нет какой-то такой прямой обязанности всегда быть гражданским рупором. Но бывают минуты, бывают моменты, когда он не может им не быть. Это 100%. Есть такие ситуации, в которых ни священник, ни патриарх, ни христианин вообще не имеют права на молчание.
Девицы, во Христа крестися, во Христа облекостися, аллилуйя. Здесь когда-то была тракторная мастерская, потом склад минеральных удобрений. Трактор большого вреда не принесет, правда, северную стену сокрушили. А вот склад минеральных удобрений, так как крыши не было, окон не было, дверей не было, в сводах проломы, то дождь на удобрение, снег на удобрение. Когда я первый раз приехал, сантиметров 30, не меньше, как вонючее болото, потому что раскисли эти удобрения, ведь мы, Советский Союз, перегнал Соединенные Штаты по производству минеральных удобрений в 1,5 раза. А председатели колхозов эти удобрения ненавидели. Здешний председатель в селе Ивановском рассказывал мне, что на улице где-то сваливать удобрения нельзя, дело подсудное, поэтому свалили в храме.
А то можно туда?
Два человека, архитекторы, специалисты, я их попросил что-то мне помочь, рассказать. Они, когда приехали, говорят: упаси Бог, тебя что-нибудь тронуть здесь. Этот храм восстанавливать нельзя, потому что в сводах были примерно метровые проломы. Они говорят, своды никто сейчас чинить не умеет. Как только начнете что-то делать, все это вам на голову обрушится. Колонны ничего не держат. Восстановили, как видите.
За 40 лет священства Георгию Эдельштейну довелось восстановить не один брошенный храм и в Курско-Белгородской, и в Вологодской, и здесь, в Костромской епархии. «Мне везло», — говорит он сам, — «каждый раз попадал в храмы, в которых долго не было службы». Воскресенскую церковь в селе Карабаново восстанавливали в буквальном смысле всем миром, кроме прихожан, которые здесь не только из окрестных сел и из Костромы, но даже из Москвы приезжают. Деньгами помогли норвежские лютеране, канадский баптист, католический священник из Ирландии. В ход шли любые подручные средства – запчасти от тракторов, утварь из краеведческого музея, даже свинцовые ставни из заброшенной ракетной шахты. Восстановили и надгробия, которые в советское время были забетонированы в землю, мешали тракторам заезжать в колхозную мастерскую.
Здесь похоронены две сестры, Анна и Мария Готовцевы. Они были инициаторами строительства этого храма. Здесь землевладельцами, что ли, вообще в Красносельском районе, во всем нашем, были Вяземские и Годуновы. И вот Вяземский, известный поэт, друг Пушкина, рассказал Анне Готовцевой о Пушкине, что а Пушкину о ней, и какие-то стихи Анны Ивановны Готовцевой были напечатаны в «Современнике». У Готовцевой, в семье Готовцевой, воспитывалась ее племянница Юлия Жадовская. Она, наверное, более известная поэтесса. На моем первом приходе в Костромской епархии. Похоронена это Юлия Жадовская.
Этот как будто случайный литературный след по местам церковного служения отца Георгия вполне уместен. По своему светскому образованию Юрий Эдельштейн – лингвист, кандидат филологических наук. Последняя гражданская должность – заведующий кафедрой английского языка в Костромском педагогическом институте, где они преподавали вместе с женой.
Здесь ему сразу предложили по конкурсу место завкафедры, и он приехал сюда. Так что он делал докторскую здесь. И успешные, очень хорошие публикации. Докторскую он писал по патристике.
Ну, докторская уже была написана, были публикации, были уже 3 отзыва. Ну, как полагается, 3 докторов, профессоров. 1 из Петербурга, 2 из Москвы. Мне мой духовник сказал, что если тебя доцентом не пускают в священники, то тем более не пустят после защиты докторской. Ну, нет, так нет. Я не верю в гипотезы, в теории воспитания. Меня воспитывали все время в духе коммунизма или какого-то там, я не знаю, социализма с человеческим лицом. Для меня это всегда была волчья морда, а не человеческое лицо. Я предполагал, что церковь – это, наверное, единственное место, если можно так выразиться, единственное учреждение, которое вне коммунистического общества. Ну, может быть, поэтому туда и стремился.
В Ленинграде вы крестились?
Ну, я не люблю произносить это слово, я не люблю произносить имя этого Анчутки.
В Петербурге?
В Петербурге.
Отец...
Смоленское кладбище. Говорят, там Блок был похоронен, потом перенесли на Волково.
Рукоположения Юрий Эдельштейн добивался 23 года. Объездил почти все епархии, благо летний отпуск у преподавателей долгий, но раз за разом получал отказ.
Говорили, что время тяжелое, что Господу Богу можно служить в любом месте и на любой должности. Вы преподаете, ну и преподавайте. Вы верующий человек, ну и хорошо. Ну, я больше чем с 20 епископами беседовал и в Прибалтике, и в Киеве, и в Средней Азии. Ответы примерно были везде одни и те же. А потом довольно случайно встретился с архиепископом Хризостомом, рукоположить. И перечисляет все минусы. Да? Доцент, владеет иностранными языками, Эдельштейн. Тут о национальности можно и не спрашивать. Эдельштейн, Рабинович. Практически одно и то же. Я говорю, так, владыка, у меня мать полька. Это еще хуже. Полька значит католичка. А на Руси католиков не любят почти так же, как жидомасонов. Это только усугубляет. Ну, обещать ничего не могу, но постараюсь, попробую. Мы с ним беседовали 1 октября. 30 октября меня вызвал архиепископ Пимен Саратовский. Я там был то ли зав канцелярии, то ли еще, может, библиотекарем, архивариусом, я не знаю. Вызвал, сказал, что у него 2 новости, хорошая и плохая. Плохая – это то, что арестован отец Глеб Якунин, а хорошая, вот я получил, сказал он, телеграмму, рукоположение возможно в любой день. Приезжайте в Курский кафедральный собор.
Как только к ним пришла бумага, что такой-то рукоположен, такого-то числа 79-го года. Так ректор Костромского, тогда пединститута, меня вызвал и сказал: вот я получил такую бумагу. Он так это интересно около, надел на очки и читает. Вот такого-то числа и так далее. Он меня спрашивает: это правда? Я говорю: как правда? Если вас такие, вам такая контора пишет, они, конечно, не врут, правда все. А что вы будете делать? Я говорю: что я буду делать? Я не рукополагалась, я как была кандидат наук, это специалист по английскому языку, так я и буду. Но вы же понимаете, что вы на идеологическом фронте, мы вас не сможем здесь больше держать. Я говорю: нет, не понимаю. У меня английский язык, а не идеологический фронт. Так мы с ним поговорили, и он был старше меня намного. Ему, конечно, самому было жутко неловко со мной разговаривать, потому что я вообще оставалась единственный кандидат на кафедре. Но он устроил одно заседание кафедры в каникулярное время, второе заседание. Мои коллеги тоже устали. Они говорят: Леонид, то есть, мы же не хотим за вас руки поднимать, вы понимаете? Вы сами напишите уж, как ректор предлагает, что по собственному желанию. Ну, в общем, были типичные советские разговоры, в которых жертва жалеет палачей. Они ко мне подходили по очереди, плакались и говорили: то есть, мы вас умоляем, не делайте из нас подлецов. Меня так тронула эта фраза, что я села и написала это. Хорошо, не буду это делать. Ну, это действительно, как бы, волнуют люди, как люди. Только они любили партию, а не деньги.
Когда мы оба работали, у нас общая зарплата у жены и у меня была около 700 рублей. Когда я стал священником, у меня было 92,80, по-моему, а у жены 0. И знающие люди были уверены, что материальные трудности как-то меня остановят. Но они не учли, что у меня очень хорошая библиотека. И я мог набрать рюкзак книг, отвезти в Москву, в букинистический магазин. Это нас первое время спасало. Но самое главное, наверное, что священнику постоянно приносят продукты. Картошку, свеклу, моркошку, лук, не знаю, яйца. Я неприхотливый, я думаю, человек, жена, тем более. А главное было, что так много лет стремился к священству, и сейчас как бы цели своей достиг. Так что я думаю, что первые годы только радость, что служишь в храме, что не участвуешь во всей этой, я не знаю, комедии или что оно такое, это коммунистическое общество.
Правда, совсем отгородиться от коммунистического общества не получалось. При формально декларировавшемся в Советском Союзе отделении церкви от государства на практике власти постоянно вмешивались в дела религиозных организаций. Для надзора за верующими при Совмине СССР был даже создан специальный орган – Совет по делам религий.
Должна быть какая-то организация, которая бы поправляла. Брала бы за локоть и говорила: так не надо. Или так надо. Поэтому, скажем так, нас недолюбливали, мягко говоря, и осуждали, но слушаться прислушивались.
Получается, из того, что вы говорите, что Совет по делам религии, будучи государственной структурой, вмешивался, в дела религиозных организаций, при том, что
как не вмешиваются? А сейчас, думаешь, не вмешиваются? Вмешиваются.
Но при этом по закону и тогда и сейчас у нас религия отделена от государства.
Это кто сказал?
Это в законах написано. И
В
тогда было, и
законах
сейчас.
написано. В законах много чего написано. Но мы живем в государстве и являемся его гражданами. И, следовательно, должны делать то, что тебе скажут. И все.
Кто тебе позволил ходить в рясе? Это первый вопрос, который мне задавали и в Белгороде, и в Вологде. Что ты вырядился, как чучело, и ходишь? Кто тебе позволил? И вот приходится полчаса, час сидеть с уполномоченным и объяснять ему, что не его дело учить меня, как мне одеваться. В подряснике или в рясе. Так убери. Другие священники убирают подрясник или ряс. И ты убери. Это не ваше дело, как я одет. Приезжаю я куда-то на кладбище панихиды служить или кого-то хоронить, прибегает секретарь парторганизации этого колхоза или совхоза. Убирайся отсюда. Почему? Тут 40 лет никаких служб не было, ты чего сюда приехал? Меня почти постоянно сопровождали какие-то уазики. Я отпеваю или служу панихиду, а из УАЗика я не знаю, что там за аппаратура, с кем-то переговариваются. Иногда пытаются мне мешать, сигналят. Ну, пригонят 3 машины, сигналят. Или кто-то придет с гармошкой и будет петь. Они поют, и я пою, или я пою, и они поют. Но я говорю, советская власть, плохая была власть, очень плохая. Но наши епископы были хуже, просто потому что они бежали впереди этой власти, были более усердными советскими людьми, чем уполномоченные.
Сотрудничество церковной иерархии с советским режимом – одна из самых трудных страниц в истории русской церкви. Отправной точкой принято считать так называемую «Декларацию о радостях» 1927 года, в которой глава Временного Синода, митрополит Сергий Строгородский, фактически присягнул на верность советской власти.
Я думаю, вы знаете интервью 30-го года, которое дал митрополит Сергий и его синод корреспондентам газеты «Правда», «Известия» и, по-моему, «Беднота». Митрополит Сергий лгал, и всем было понятно, что лжет. Он говорил, что никаких гонений на религию в молодой Советской Республике не существует, что ни один священник не пострадал за свои религиозные убеждения. Он говорил, что церкви не закрываются, а если закрываются, то только по решению жителей этого населенного пункта, скажем так, города, деревни. Сейчас, правда, наши секулярные историки установили и утверждают, что никакого интервью не было, что это интервью, вопросы и ответы было написано Емельяном Ярославским по должности главным безбожником, я могу сказать, нашего государства. Государство, конечно, не мое, но Советской Республики. Потом его отредактировал товарищ Молотов и окончательно отредактировал Иосиф Виссарионович Сталин. Вот оно и было напечатано. Знаете, вот в одном из стихотворений Эдуарда Багрицкого, ТБЦ, Багрицкий встречается с тенью уже к тому времени умершего Феликса Эдмундовича. А век поджидает на мостовой, сосредоточен, как часовой. Иди и не бойся с ним рядом встать. Твое одиночество веку подстать. Оглянешься, а вокруг враги. Руку протянешь, и нет друзей. Но если он скажет «солги», солги. И если он скажет «убей», убей. Это то, что мы с вами говорили, мораль и нравственность нашего родного коммунистического государства. Если тебе скажут «солги», солги. Митрополит Сергий всю жизнь, до последних дней своей жизни, лгал. лгал сознательно, своей ложью, как сейчас говорят апологеты Сергия, спасая церковь. Я не верю, что церковь можно спасти ложью.
Московская патриархия очень часто за границей выступала с заявлениями, что с церковью в России все в порядке, что нас никто больше не гонит. Я помню печальные заявления митрополита Петерима покойного. И он открытым текстом говорил, что никто нас не преследует, мы совершенно свободны. На Всемирных Советах Церквей об этом заявляли. Так что это самое, конечно, было уродливое проявление. Потом это движение за мир во всем мире. Это была, в общем, пропаганда советского правительства, что мы хотим разоружения одностороннее в основном. И патриархия повторяла за этим. Они надеялись, что вот к церковным деятелям с доверием относятся, епископ не будет врать. Но они были использованы как инструмент советской пропаганды, к сожалению.
Ну вот, например, в течение 1967 года в составе религиозной делегации и групп и по другим каналам направлялись за границу с контрразведывательными заданиями. И для выполнения других задач органов КГБ 122 агента. Агенту Святославу, одному из руководителей РПЦ, было поручено во время поездки на остров Крит на заседание Всемирного Совета Церквей сделать остановку в Риме и при встрече с высокопоставленными чиновниками Ватикана высказать свою озабоченность усилением антисоветской пропаганды со стороны зарубежных религиозных центров.
Это донесение из архивов 4-го отдела 5-го управления КГБ, рассекреченных после провала августовского путча специальной комиссии Верховного Совета России. За непродолжительное время своей работы комиссия во главе с депутатом Львом Пономаревым опубликовала десятки документов отдела, курировавшего религиозные организации.
Комиссия обращает внимание руководства РПЦ на антиконституционное использование Центральным комитетом КПСС и органами КГБ СССР ряда церковных органов в своих целях путем вербовки и засылки в них агентуры КГБ. Так, по линии отдела внешних церковных отношений выезжали за рубеж и выполняли задания руководства КГБ агенты, обозначенные кличками: Святослав, Адамант, Михайлов, Топас, Нестерович, Кузнецов, Огнев, Исауленко и другие.
Реакция какая-нибудь была на это обращение со стороны патриархии?
Никакой. Абсолютно никакой реакции не было. Пожалуй, был единственный пример, когда архиепископ Вильнюсский Хризостом высказал, что да, я служил, так сказать, я в этом разочарован и так далее. В смысле, я приношу как бы извинения за всю эту деятельность.
Архиепископ Виленский и Литовский Хризостом – тот самый, который, будучи курским архиепископом, в 1979 году рукоположил в священники кандидата филологических наук Юрия Эдельштейна. Отец Георгий говорит, что не склонен к мистике, но получилось так, что именно рукоположивший его архиепископ оказался единственным из иерархов Московской патриархии, публично рассказавшим о своих связях с КГБ.
Я был первым человеком, который вслух заявил, что многие священнослужителями являются тайными агентами КГБ. Мне довелось в конце августа 1991 года быть в редакции газеты «Аргументы и факты». И тогда появилось интервью в этой газете. Это было двоедушие. Это было сотрудничество с репрессивным органом. Были журналисты, КГБшники, писатели, поэты, инженеры, летчики, кто угодно. Для священнослужителя, я думаю, это наиболее позорно, вредно, потому что, инженер еще, наверное, может быть двоедушным. А вот священнослужитель, по-моему, принципиально не может. Я думаю, что любой человек, который сотрудничал с КГБ, будь то епископ, священник, лаик, безразлично, должен покаяться. А мы, христиане, следуя словам, призывам Христа, должны их простить. Я их критикую только потому или только за то, что они не покаялись.
Отец Георгий много лет говорит и пишет о сергианстве, о грехе сотрудничества церковных иерархов с советской властью, о необходимости и важности покаяния. И в церковных, и в светских кабинетах он давно заслужил репутацию диссидента. Сам он не только не любит это слово, но и вообще не считает себя ни диссидентом, ни правозащитником, хотя и является соучредителем восстановленной в конце 80-х московской хельсинской группы. А однажды статус диссидента был присвоен Георгию Эдельштейну почти официально. Сделал это во время визита в Москву в мае 1988 года президент США Рональд Рейган.
Он был второй секретарь американского посольства, может быть, первый, не знаю. Молодой человек как-то позвонил мне, сказал, что меня приглашают в посольство. Я пришел, президент Рейган приглашает вас на прием в Спасо-хаусе. Я сказал, не приду. Почему? Я не интересуюсь политикой, я не политик, я священнослужитель.
И тогда хитрый приглашающий сказал, ну вот у нас можно приходить с детьми, спросите сына, может быть, он захочет. И папа позвонил в Кострому, и я закричал, да-да, конечно, как можно отказываться, когда еще увидишь американского президента.
То есть он из-за вас сюда пришел?
И папа дал слабину и согласился один день побыть диссидентом.
I wanted to convey to you that you have the prayers and support of the American people, indeed of people throughout the world, so that all those working for human rights throughout this vast land, from the Urals to Kamchatka, from the Laptev Sea to the Caspian, might be encouraged and take heart.
Встреча сыграла такую большую роль в его судьбе. Известия, по-моему, написали тогда что-то возмущенное про там, кого же пригласили в Спасо-хаус, или как-то называлась эта статья, и там упоминалась папина фамилия, что вот, мол, какого-то непонятного папа из Костромы, который даже не служит.
А еще через день, по-моему, меня уже искал и Совет по делам религии в Москве, и уполномоченный Совета в Костроме, и Костромской архиепископ Касьян. Я пришел в Совет по делам религии. Со мной очень любезно побеседовали, спросили, почему я шляюсь по Москве и ручкаюсь с президентами. Разве это обязанность священника? Я согласился. Нет, конечно, нет. Почему вы не едете на приход?
Прихода у отца Георгия не было уже 1,5 года. В январе 87-го указом правящего архиерея Вологодской епархии он был запрещен в служении за организацию летнего христианского лагеря. Многочисленные обращения к церковным и светским властям результата не дали. И в патриархии, и в Совете по делам религий смотрели куда-то наверх и ссылались на непреодолимые препятствия.
Он ходил по всем дверям. А мне этого не дают, а мне этого не дают. Да, не давали. И я не буду скрывать и открывать. Не давали.
Почему?
Шибко умный.
Это
вас это не устраивает?
Так 1,5 года не устанавливали, а потом вдруг установили.
А потом вдруг восстановили. Он приехал, поехал туда к нему. Отец Георгий.
К Рейгану?
К Рейгану. Он здесь в Москве же, американский посольство.
И что дальше?
А что дальше? А дальше позвонило наше начальство, или вернее, я не знаю, кто вперед, и сказали, да дайте вы эти головешки. И отдали.
Официально было сказано мне в Совете по делам религий, что патриарх Пимен в феврале назначил меня настоятелем храма в селе Ушаково Буйского района Костромской епархии. По-моему, ответ совершенно невежественный, потому что патриарх не назначает настоятелей сельских храмов. Президент Рейган, спасибо ему, действительно вернул меня в храм.
С Рональдом Рейганом в жизни Георгия Эдельштейна связана любопытная рифма. За полгода до встречи в Спасо-хаусе в ноябре 1987-го президент США принимал в Белом доме активистов движения за свободу еврейской эмиграции из СССР. В числе участников встречи был старший сын отца Георгия Юлий Эдельштейн, многолетний отказник, один из организаторов подпольной сети преподавания иврита в Советском Союзе, незадолго до того освободившийся после почти 3-летнего заключения по ложному обвинению в хранении наркотиков. Все время, что Юлий находился в лагере, в мире шла кампания в его защиту. Освобождение одного из последних советских политзаключенных требовали государственные и общественные деятели, правозащитные организации, нобелевские лауреаты. Обращение к Михаилу Горбачеву по делу Юлия Эдельштейна подписали более 40 членов Американского Конгресса.
We tried to keep the case alive, to let Yulia as best as we could to know that he is not alone, that we stand in solidarity with him, and that we will not relent in our advocacy until he is released.
Один раз меня опер порадовал на первой вот еще зоне на Выдрино. Я помню, так с работы возвращались, такие уставшие, 11 часов где-то примерно на свежем воздухе. Вот. И он на плаце меня тормознул, говорит: осужденный Эдельштейн, иди сюда. И капитан Павлов такой был, опер, и говорит: чтоб ты знал, у меня в сейфе для тебя писем полно со всех стран мира, а я тебе ни одно письмо не отдам, потому что не положено по закону. Самая страшная история у многих моих друзей, не у многих, но у некоторых моих друзей была, когда родители или близкие начинали по тем или иным причинам, или изначально говорили: куда тебя понесло против нашей любимой Родины там, и так далее, или из страха. А у меня, я, по крайней мере, точно знал, что есть полная спина от родителей в этом отношении с самого начала.
I was in the Soviet Union in January 1988. I was part of the first ever International Helsinki Federation for Human Rights delegation, the former Soviet Union. Somebody came up to me, and he was in priestly garb, and he said to me, you know, you represented my son. And I said, who is your son? And as I was saying to him, I was saying to him, who was it? Who did I represent, you know, whose father was an Orthodox priest? It wasn't Sharansky, it wasn't Slipak, it wasn't Begun. I didn't know who it could be. And then he said to me, Yulie Edelstein.
После освобождения и переезда в Израиль Юлий занялся общественной, а затем и политической деятельностью. Избирался в парламент, занимал ведущие должности в кабинете министров. В 2013 году стал спикером Кнессета. Юлий Эдельштейн – один из самых высокопоставленных русскоговорящих политиков в истории Израиля и единственный, выросший в православной семье. Каждый год, как правило, в конце лета или осенью, отец Георгий приезжает к старшему сыну. Здесь, на святой для главных мировых религий земле, он, по собственным словам, ощущает себя дома, не только по вере, но и по крови своих предков.
Я с огромной радостью хожу по камням Иудеи. Я понимаю, что по этой земле, по этой тропиночке пришел сюда мой прапрадедушка Авраам. Я радуюсь этому. Это моя земля. Это родина моих предков. Понимаете, если меня в чем-то упрекают, в том числе, что я то ли еврей, то ли еще что-то, но я сам вспоминаю, и я говорю своим слушателям или своим писателям, что я действительно горд, помня, что мои далекие предки, мои пра-пра-пра-дедушки сидели вот здесь, в этой пустыне, на голой земле, и ученики Иисуса, апостолы, раздавали всем, кто здесь, на этой земле сидел, кусочки рыбы и кусочки хлеба.
Если бы я знал, на что был бы похож Моисей, я бы сказал, что отец Георгий на Моисея похож физически. Но во всяком случае, знаете, эти классические изображения классиков наших, да, когда изображают Моисея с скрижалями. И вот отец Георгий, такая шевелюра у него, борода такая. Я думаю, его еврейство даже украшает его священство.
Практически все архиереи, под амафором которых мне довелось служить, в той или иной форме напоминали мне о моем 5-м пункте. Напоминали и напоминали. Как правило, если нужно было меня в чем-то упрекнуть, сказать, что я плохой, тогда вспоминали 5-й пункт.
А со стороны рядовых прихожан вы когда-нибудь слышали такое?
Никогда ни одного слова.
Национальность – понятие чуждое христианству, говорит отец Георгий. Для Бога нет ни эллина, ни иудея, но век, в который выпало жить, напоминал об этой теме постоянно, иногда самым страшным образом.
Я думаю, что из 10-11 девчонок и мальчишек, с которыми я бегал, играл в казаки-разбойники или в лапту, в Киеве до 1941 года, в живых остались 2-3. Я среди них. Я никогда не могу ответить на вопрос, почему я сижу сегодня здесь, в Иерусалиме, а они все в Бабьем Яру. Это один из неразрешимых для меня вопросов. Я очень легко тоже мог оказаться там, потому что в то время уехать из Киева нельзя. Вывозили станки или высокопоставленных каких-то. Уйти пешком нельзя. На Дарницком мосту через Днепр стоят люди с винтовками. Уехать в Одессу, где жила мамина сестра, нельзя. Просто так на пароход не пускают. Поэтому максимальная вероятность, что и отец, и мать, и я остаемся в Киеве. И очень многие наши знакомые говорили: да ладно, немцы цивилизованные люди, они просто так не убивают, оставайтесь. И ночью, то ли в час, то ли в 2 ночи, крик во дворе: Эдельштейн, Эдельштейн. Мы кубарем скатились с лестницы. Этот человек, секретарь парторганизации, на машине М1, если вы помните, такие М-ки черные, во дворе: скорей, скорей, поезд отходит, скорей. Дверь была открыта, такая на шарнирах дверь, и затолкал нас в этот отходящий поезд.
Но у меня не было жестокого гетто в таком смысле, как немецкий гетто. Слава Богу, обошлось. Мы вместе с родителями уцелели. Это было Транснистрия, это была определенная область Восточной Украины, которая тогда сделали, она была занята румынами. Это было на берегу Буга. Так вот, на одной стороне Буга было румынское гетто, а на другой были немецкие гетто. И вот те, которые попали на другую сторону, те все были истреблены. А потом уже я все-таки была взрослым ребенком, но ребенком я этого знать не могла, до этого никто не знал. Оказывается, немцы у румынов несколько раз требовали отдать им евреев, но они не отдавали. Единственное, мы последние 3 ночи сидели в заперти, когда отступали уже немцы. Мы очень боялись, что когда эсэсовцы пройдут, они сделают остановку и нас всех перестреляют. Этого мы боялись. У нас не было ни подвала, ничего. Но это, к счастью, они так драпали действительно на наших глазах. Бегом шли все войска, которые шли бегом.
Когда я первый раз стал министром в 1996 году, один журналист из израильской газеты «Маариф» поехал в Кострому, встретился с моими родителями. И он у меня при этом интересно, что пытался перед этим у меня получить такой, как бы, фон для этого интервью, ничего враждебного. Объясни, а как вы с ним? Я говорю, ты знаешь, давай лучше наоборот сделаем. Ты поедешь с отцом, познакомишься, а потом придешь. И он когда приехал, он сказал, да нет, у меня нет уже этих вопросов.
Мы с моим старшим сыном, с Юликом, исповедуем он иудаизм, а я христианство, но это никогда нас на 1 миллиметр не отдалило друг от друга. Мы с ним никогда по этим проблемам не только не спорим, но и не беседуем. Я не хожу в синагогу не потому, что я думаю, что там какое-то глубокое заблуждение, а просто потому, что я не говорю на языке, на котором говорят в синагоге. Вот и все. Я сидел у него за столом в рясе с крестом. Он ничего против этого не имел. Возражала, правда, его жена, к сожалению, покойная Татьяна. Она говорила, Юрий Михайлович, вы портите карьеру вашему сыну. Юлик, смеясь, говорил, да нет, в Израиле минимум 1 миллион христиан. Если они узнают, что мой отец православный священник, минимум каждый второй из них будет за меня голосовать. Человек с хорошим чувством юмора. Понимаете, я глубоко убежден, что самое лучшее всегда говорить правду. Я думаю, что если я здесь, в этих интервью, говорил правду, то это не испортило карьеру моему. Сыну дало возможность тоже сказать правду. Вот и все.
«Право на правду» – так называется известная статья Ивана Ильина, любимого мыслителя отца Георгия. Также он назвал и собственную книгу. Сам он старается следовать этому принципу всю жизнь, задолго до рукоположения, когда на экзамене в институте сказал, что коммунистической нравственности не существует, а есть только религиозная. Когда на допросе в ленинградском КГБ отказался давать показания на своего товарища, впоследствии известного диссидента Бориса Вайля, когда аспирантам помогал в составлении письма 2 московских священников – Николая Ишлемана и Глеба Якунина о соучастии церковных иерархов в антирелигиозной политике советского государства, когда и сегодня продолжает критиковать сергианство – порочную практику чересчур тесных отношений между священнослужителями и гражданской властью.
Отец Георгий человек очень такого характера, с которым очень трудно договориться. Он никогда не идет на компромиссы, он никогда не будет прогибаться. Вспоминаешь вот этих людей, которые действительно заложили фундамент не диссидентского движения, а движения за свободу мысли, за свободу человеческой личности, за свободу его веры, за свободу его слова. Когда вспоминаешь об этих действительно колоссальных людях, которые жили в нашей стране вот в эти годы, 60-е, 70-е, 80-е годы, понимаешь, что отец Георгий один из них.
Это было лето 88-го года, еще советское время. И, в общем, я помню, как мы шли мимо каких-то общежитий, и там с балкона высовывались, пальцами вот так показывали, как на какое-то диковинное создание. О, поп идет, поп. В общем, он так шел, и он был именно священником, а не попом. Хотя он сказал, я горжусь своим именем попа, но он был как священник. И тогда как раз я сказал, давайте вы окрестите меня. Человек, идущий против системы, против рожна, это человек, вызывающий уважение, знающий, что он рискует, знающий, что его могут за это лишить работы, свободы, жизни, может быть, даже при каких-то обстоятельствах, понимаете? И он свою жизнь проживает, он уже очень пожилой человек, так, что было видно, что ясно, что он всегда следует за своими принципами, за идеями. Это дорогого стоит.
Очень упертый, очень независимый. Не хотел бы быть его руководителем ни на какой работе. Очень серьезный. То есть, если дать ему какое-то задание, которое ему интересно. Понятно, что нет такого, что он не сделает в любой области. Может сдвинуть горы, когда знает для чего и зачем. Апропо, все там отстроенные храмы в этих самых непонятных, откуда взявшихся деревнях и местах. Притягивает людей как магнит, хотя не прилагает для этого особых усилий.
Еще в детском саду меня обучали молчи, не говори. Воспитательница во время мертвого часа сняла со стены портрет такого Постышева. Когда мертвый час закончился, мы пошли на полдник. Я спрашиваю, а почему вы сняли товарища Постышева? И первой именно она сказала «чш» и ушла. Я спросил маму, почему сняли товарища Постышева. Она сказала то же самое «чш». Нужен был какой-то собеседник. Первым попался кот. Он сидел под кроватью, я туда залез и пообещал ему не лгать и никому не говорить «чш». И я не рассчитываю ни на какой результат абсолютно. Я не агитатор, я не пропагандист. Я не делаю это для того, чтобы люди пошли за мной. Это никогда не команда «действуй, как я». Я считаю своей обязанностью сказать то, что я думаю. Ну, то, что правило «Dixi et animam meam levavi». Сказал и облегчил свою душу. Да? Если ты что-то знаешь, ты обязан говорить. Великий богослов, учитель церкви Григорий Богослов говорил, что молчанием предается Бог. Если мы молчим, мы как бы участвуем в том зле, которое происходит в мире. Я обязан сказать, что я думаю, а результаты моего говорения меня совершенно не интересуют. Кто услышит, как отреагирует. Моя обязанность не молчать. Повторяю, молчанием, я убежден, предается Бог. Господу помолимся о ежебытии сыновом света и дщерям, наследникам вечных благ. Господу помолимся, еже услышите Господу Богу глас моления нашего. Господу помолимся, заступи, спаси, помилуй и сохрани нас, Боже, Твоею благодатью, пресвятую, пречистую, преблагословенную, славную Владычицу нашу, Богородицу и пресную Деву Марию, со всеми святыми помянувши сами себе и друг друга, и всю жизнь нашу Христу Богу предадим.
For joining not only to see the documentary, but for the discussion we're about to have on dissent and persecution in Russia, from Father Edelstein to Vladimir Kara-Murza. I want to thank the Reagan Institute, Roger and Rachel. It's awesome working with you. Really appreciate it. I want to give a shout out to the NED team, our Russia team that Vladimir knows very well is here. Thank you, as well as our comms team. And while Rachel was right that I'm the president of the endowment, I do want to recognize the true chairman of the endowment, Ken Wallach, who is with us tonight as well. We've got an extraordinary panel to have a conversation about what this experience means for the resistance, the dissident movement today. You've heard from Evgenia already. She's not only Vladimir Kara-Murza's wife, she's the advocacy coordinator for Free Russia Foundation. And for those of you who know Evgenia and who is very reluctant to have to take on this role, I just want to say how extraordinary it is that you have found your voice. You have been an extraordinary, effective advocate for Vladimir. It's partly why we are here tonight to spotlight him and to listen to you. We're joined by Jamie Fly, our good friend who is president and CEO of the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Thank you for being here, Jamie. Natalia Arnaud, who's been at the heart of so much of this over the years as president and founder of the Free Russia Foundation. And my good friend, Ambassador Andrew Bremberg, who's with us from the president of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. The timing of this, yes, was delayed, as Rachel said, but I think Vladimir had a sense for timing. And so we're doing this, we're hosting this the week that the International Religious Freedom Summit is taking place in Washington, a theme that is underscored by this documentary, whether it's the communist manipulation of the Orthodox Church, what we see the CCP doing to Tibetan Buddhism. But it's also a timing that's auspicious because under the wrap of darkness, and I think we'll talk about this, Vladimir's trial is about to begin. And this is an effort to help keep him, in our mind, out in the world and to keep pressure that he not be forgotten as they try to go through what will be a sham trial. This film is clearly about moral clarity, but it's also about hope. That's what Vladimir represents. And so before I jump into the conversations, I want to share a little bit that Evgenia's aware of. First of all, Vladimir sent me a letter as well in which he underscored how important it was when he was in prison that his family be okay, how worried he was about you. Nothing matters more to me in my current circumstances than my family, Evgenia and my family. And knowing the knowledge that they will be able to weather this storm, thanks to the support of you and so many friends of theirs, this, from the bottom of my heart, is what I'm grateful for. So most of all, out of everything that's happening, I will miss my family, and I know they will miss me. And so, Evgenia, we're glad to be joined by, we have Katya, Sonia, Daniel. We're really glad to be joined by Vladimir's children, having your whole family with us tonight. He also talked about his family, as you mentioned, his grandfather. And he said, look, my grandfather survived the Gulag, survived service in World War II. I will survive this. And he shared with us something that's chilling, that sets the scene for our conversation. Miriam Landskog will remember, we had lunch with him just hours before he left the United States to go to Dulles. You remember Natalia, on his way back to Moscow. And we were concerned. Why are you going back to Moscow? And he said, I want to quote Natalia Gorbanevskaya, one of the 7 demonstrators on Red Square in August of 1968, who was there to protest the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. She said her primary motivation for going in the face of certain imprisonment was the knowledge that the authorities would never again be able to claim that everyone in the Soviet Union approved of the invasion. That month, a Prague newspaper wrote, we now have at least 7 reasons for which we will never be able to hate the Russian people. Today, there are thousands of people in Russia who speak for a better, a freer, a more hopeful Russia, and despite everything that's happening today, I am certain this will be more hopeful time will come, and we will begin the important work of building a democratic Russia and reintegrating it into the civilized world, and this time, we better get it right. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, how the legacy of the dissident movement in the Soviet Union inspires what we see, the courage of people like Vladimir today. So I do want to start with you, and we want to start with, you shared a little bit about Vladimir. We heard his voice in your letter. But tell us a little bit about his situation, what you're expecting with the trial, why these conversations are so important, and how you have been able to weather this with your family.
Well, thank you very much, Damon, for your kind words, for talking about us, the kids, and myself. You know what? Many people find Vladimir inspiring. Many people admire him for his courage. Well, I do too. I have lived with my husband for almost 20 years now, and every time I hear him speak, I'm in awe. And I cannot not believe what he says, because he's so convincing, because he's so hopeful, because he's so optimistic, and he knows that it can be done, because as a historian, he's seen it happen time and again. And you know, it doesn't take much courage to fight for someone like him, honestly. So whatever I'm doing because he's my soulmate, and because as a Russian citizen, as the wife of a political prisoner, as a mother of three, I believe it is my duty to not be silent in the face of those atrocities that are happening today, both in Ukraine and in Russia and in Belarus. I mean, the entire region is. So I consider it my duty to not stay silent and to continue Vladimir's work for as long as he's unable to do it himself. And when we talk, well, Vladimir it's always difficult for me when I'm asked to tell about Vladimir's situation, because of course Vladimir would never allow me to make it about himself. I have to continue his work speaking on behalf of political prisoners in the Russian Federation. And according to Memorial, Russia's most respected human rights organization, there are currently 526 political prisoners in the Russian Federation, and only a couple of weeks ago there were 502 of those. So that number is growing by the day. And according to Memorial itself, this is a very conservative number, because they are using very strict criteria to determine someone a political prisoner, criteria recognized by such international organizations as OSCE and PACE. And so it takes them a while to determine someone a political prisoner. And according to Sergei Davidis, who's head of Memorial's program on political prisoners, the real number is probably twice or thrice as high. Vladimir is one of political prisoners in the Russian Federation today. His conditions today are not the worst. I have to say it, this is why it is so important to speak about these people. I believe that Vladimir, talking about safety in a Russian prison is a very difficult thing. How can anyone be safe there? We know that the Russian penitentiary system is notorious for the use of torture, for the use of punitive psychiatry, for sexual violence and beatings, and all of that is there, and it's happening on a daily basis. But when we talk about these people, when we attract attention, when we name names, when we tell specific stories, it is much harder for the authorities to do those things against these people. This is why I believe that it is so important to continue talking, to continue raising the problem of political persecution. And this is why it is so important to not just think about numbers when we talk about these people, but to think about stories, personal stories, the people behind these numbers. As I mentioned in my introductory speech, thousands of Russians have been detained since last February for opposing the war in Ukraine. Over 20,000 people have been detained across the country, and 19,500 of those were detained for saying no to the war, saying no to the regime. And that is a big number. That is much more than the 7 people who protested in 1968 against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia on the Red Square. So those were 7 people in the population of around 300 million. But these were stories behind these people. 2 of them ended up in psychiatric prisons where they spent years. That was Natalia Gorbanevska and Viktor Feinberg, who recently passed away, sadly. And I remember that when Vladimir Bukovsky, who himself went through a psychiatric prison, he remembered the case of Gorbanevska, and he said that in the Soviet times, many were actually ready to go to prison for standing up to the Soviet regime, for opposing the Soviet regime. There were quite many people who were prepared to serve a few years prison sentence for that, but not many were prepared to go through punitive psychiatry, where people were broken. And when Gorbanevska talked about her experience in Vladimir's first documentary, They Chose Freedom, it's actually also available on YouTube if anyone's interested. So when Natalia Gorbanevska remembered her experience, she said that every day she would wake up in that prison and check herself. Am I still in the right mind? Or have I already lost it? Every single day. Can you imagine that? And punitive psychiatry is widely used nowadays again. Because as it was in the Soviet times, as it is today, anyone who opposes the official narrative, the state narrative, is seen, portrayed by the state, is either a criminal, like Vladimir, or an insane person. Vladimir himself has now 3 criminal cases against him. The first one for publicly speaking out against the war and denouncing the crimes committed by the Russian army in Ukraine. The second criminal charge came in during the summer months. He was accused of organizing an event in support of political prisoners at Moscow's Sakharov Center. Yet another organization that was recently declared undesirable in Russia, because anything to do with human rights is obviously undesirable in Putin's Russia. And the third criminal case against him was initiated in October, and that is high treason. High treason based on 3 public speeches that Vladimir made on international platforms at NATO, at the US Congress, just steps away from here, and at the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, where he talked about total censorship and the need for the Russian population to have access to independent information. He talked about the illegitimate character of the 2020 so-called constitutional referendum that allowed Vladimir Putin to make himself into a Tsar. And he talked about political repression in Russia. Based on these 3 speeches, Vladimir is accused by the Russian state of high treason, because this regime completely believes that its interests coincide with the interests with the entire country.
Thank you, Evgenia. I want to bring in, let me come in, yes, thank you. Let me bring in Andrew. I want to jump to you, Andrew. It's clear the legacy of Soviet dissidents, Soviet-era dissidents like Father Edelstein, it's vital to Russia's modern democratic movement. And given your perch, I just want to get more context on the film that we've seen. How do you think about continuities that exist between the late Soviet regime, the current Putin regime, the differences, and how this has impacted victims of communism?
Absolutely. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel on such an incredible film. At Victims of Communism, I know we had the opportunity to partner with Vladimir in years past and to show his first documentary years ago. To your question, we just opened our Victims of Communism Museum, 1 block from here, where we highlight many of the stories of past victims of communism, of course recognizing there are those still, millions around the world victimized by communist regimes today. And of course we see in Russia this kind of primordial existence of a failed post-communist regime. Of course, it's not technically a communist state anymore, but we know that, Putin runs the totalitarian nature of the state like a post-KGB thug that he is, coming from the communist experience. And I think both the film, but also what's so just incredible about the film is the kind of foreshadowing of Vladimir's own life and experience in the film. I don't want. I'll come back from that, but more to your question, that we see both in Father Edelstein's example, but then also in the film the history that he's going back to, and the decades of religious persecution under the Soviets in Russia, but also throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Key elements that it was quite impressive to see Father Edelstein highlight in the film of any ideology, any belief system that deviates from the Soviet communist dictatorship model was a threat to the state and had to be suppressed and persecuted. And of course, as we saw, the best way, one of the most effective ways of doing that was to co-opt it and to try to control it. And this is what we saw through decades of Soviet oppression, of infiltration through various religious institutions and attempts to infiltrate various elements of civil society throughout the Soviet empire. We see today in Russia, where Putin attempts to, through propaganda, not just domestically, but internationally, and I'm sure maybe Jamie will talk about this, try to put in light honest people who are speaking the truth about their own experience as agents, foreign agents, or representatives of foreign powers, when what they are doing is they are speaking the powerful truth of, not to take away from their heroism, but the average experience of a person in that society. That's one thing that, as we've welcomed visitors to our museum, that we convey is both the powerful individual stories of individual people who act so heroically, but also the fact that their experiences, in fact, are actually quite common for the millions who live or have lived under these regimes. What makes them heroic is that they've stood up and taken actions about that many were too afraid to. But what they experienced, the type of persecution they faced, is actually quite common. So I think understanding the conflict that we face today and the challenge that we face today, what is critical is understanding the historical context that this is rooted in. This is not something new, and that I think importantly, and I hope inspirationally, we've seen examples how in the past, and it doesn't happen right away. In many cases, it took years or decades, but the heroism of these individuals and their commitment to the truth and to speaking the truth was successful. And that is an important reminder that we, particularly in the United States and all throughout the West, where we don't know how incredibly blessed we are with the freedoms that we have, that we frequently take for granted, need to take upon ourselves the responsibility to speak the truth and to speak out and to demand that our own political leadership and government and representatives, those who represent us, demand actions in the international space that comport with our values.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. I want to come to Natalia, to you. You've been on the front lines of what this means for many of those individuals. As Evgenia said, according to human rights groups, different from Memorial's strict categorization of political prisoners, According to human rights monitors, over 19,335, at least you may have more up-to-date numbers, Natalia, Russians have been arrested for anti-war activity since the beginning of the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's essentially 56 Russians a day being arrested for anti-war activity, probably mounting. And you're right, many of them are colleagues. Vladimir, Ilya Yashin, who's in for 8.5-year sentence. Alexandra Skolchenko, who was replacing price tags with anti-war messages, in for 10 years. And of course, Alexei Navalny. But Natalia, you've been on the front lines of this. Can you give us a sense of the situation for political prisoners, those arrested for anti-war activity in Russia today, and how this really has compared to the past?
Thank you so much. Really huge honor for me to be here. We all know Vladimir as a very courageous politician, absolutely amazing, eloquent speaker, very good in-depth historian and expert. He's also a great filmmaker. You remember his first documentary. I remember the screening of the previous documentary at MED when Senator McCain was there as well. So yeah, and we talk with Evgenia daily, and I receive letters from Vladimir quite often. I talk to his lawyers weekly. But boy, it was so hard to start hearing his voice on this documentary.
Yes.
I'm sure very soon Rachel will receive another letter from prison saying, like, let's have a launch of my book, Prison Memoirs. I just hope it's like something like maybe in the fall of this year, so that we'll give him some time to write in summer. Yeah, it's crazy. And what Evgenia said is also very, very important, that in all these letters I'm receiving from him, I saw that there are two major topics, and yesterday, in this last letter I received from him, I understood, and he described it best himself. He said that every person has his big world, like his principles, his vision, his mission, commitments, his work, everything the person does, his motherland. But also he has a small world, his family, everybody he loves. And in all his letters, of course, these two subjects are the most important ones. And while we are talking about all these numbers, over 500 political prisoners in Russia, over 1 million all over the world, it's crazy to think about all these statistics. But yes, behind each political prisoner is a human story, is a human tragedy. It's people, it's their families around them, it's their friends, it's their colleagues, everybody else. We are all in jail together with Vladimir. And another thing, it's probably a project for me. Everybody else who would like to join me, one of the next projects will be a documentary about Vladimir, because this documentary inspired me that a future, like very soon, hopefully, foreign minister of a free and democratic Russia, former political prisoner, and we are also doing this documentary all together about him. And this is what he does. He's a real ambassador of those Russians who believe in democracy and freedom, and that Russia needs all this, and the entire world needs that. And while the whole priority is now Ukraine, and while what happened on February last year, and in 2014 and 2008, it's huge, most terrible nightmare and scenario that Russia is developing at the moment. Again, the situation can change, and this stability in this region, entire region, will be sustainable only when there is a real change inside Russia. And this will be our biggest battlefield for all of us, for democracy, anti-war, anti-regime Russians, together with Vladimir, with everybody else. Because again, values don't change overnight. The Soviet Union collapsed, but again, it didn't completely die. It still lives in many people's minds and practices and everything else. We do need a lot of history. We need people like Vladimir who can explain all this. And it's very important also to remember that back then in the Soviet times, President Reagan was saying, we American people, we are with you, with those Soviet people who understand, who value democracy and human rights. We support you, we see you. It's very important now for us, for democracy Russians, that the world sees our efforts. Vladimir does it every time in all his letters to anybody, to all his friends, to all his opinion pieces in Washington Post, in all the speeches and the events. Evgenia reads his letters. He asks everybody not to forget about efforts of all of us. What is you said big number, 90,000 is a huge number of all those Russians. It's very underreported. The best number to remember is number one. There was only one day since the full-scale invasion started, but there was no protest in Russia, no Russian was arrested. I think it was June 13th, according to the info. Every day something is happening in Russia. And of course the price for people's courage is very huge, as you can understand. People cut television cables, they set conscription centers on fire, they do a lot of information spreading. Even like there is a project, print out internet, because again they understand that there is no access for many people to real information, and of course what they see on TV is absolutely terrible, and they just print out all this news and truthful materials of really what happened in Ukraine, and so many Russians still.
Natalia, let me ask, we were talking about this before, that there's a lot of folks who follow the news, they see reporting about Russian support for the war, and they've challenged, is it possible? How can you even think of a democratic Russia? What do you say to the skeptics who are questioning whether the Russian people are behind this and whether there is the possibility to imagine a democratic Russia? We've talked a little bit about this, so I wanted to draw you out on stage.
Well, very good question, and the one I think about every day, the one I live every day. And if I see a lot of voices, I can understand them, that like something like Russia is a lost cause. Well, if Russia is a lost cause, we are all doomed. We cannot, we understand these the sentiments, but we pro-democracy Russians, we cannot afford thinking about this. And if I was only listening to pollsters, some analysts, some politicians, I would probably be very, very depressed and demoralized. But my organization, Evgenia and others, we work with people. We see all these people. We see so many new emerging initiatives. We see all this like inside country exiled Russians. Like 80% of anti-war initiatives in Georgia of Russians, they are like all to help Ukraine. We see a lot of underground activities now inside Russia. As I said, like not only like protests, like visible protests, because again, this regime still is capable of building as many gulags as they need to, but doing anything they can every day, every second. It's very important to remember those actions.
We're going to supplement the mic, Natalia. Let me bring in Jamie. Jamie, essentially what we see is a Kremlin, a Russian effort to silence the truth. And to go at pretty great lengths to do so, whether putting someone like Vladimir in prison for his remarks publicly to what your organization has had to go through. So how do you think about efforts to ensure that information is reaching a Russian audience? And how has this impacted your organization work? You've got a lot of journalists that have been exposed. Share us a little bit about that.
Thanks, Damon. And it's humbling to be here, especially with Evgenia, who I had heard a lot about from Vladimir over the years, but only met after he was in prison when she visited us in Prague. I had told Vladimir over the last several years that I was going to stop speaking at conferences that he was at because I always got stuck right after him on the agenda, and he was impossible to follow. There was no point. I had nothing else to say after Vladimir. I feel that a little bit now with Evgenia. I'm optimistic based on what we've seen on the ground from our people who are still working inside Russia. I'm also optimistic because Vladimir is optimistic, and he, over the last several years, has been someone I've always been able to go to get advice about how we should be doing things differently inside Russia, given that he was there so frequently, hearing his frank assessments of our programming. And the amazing thing is he's still able to do that now. I have my own letter that I've gotten from him where he's still able to provide advice from prison, which is remarkable. And I've, unfortunately, at RFE, had a number of my journalists detained. I have 3 in prison right now. Letter writing is important. That's a lesson I think we should all take away from the film as well. It was the case decades ago. It's incredibly important now. I still hear stories from released prisoners about the wardens saying similar things, that we have a safe full of letters from all around the world. Those things matter when people are in prison and their jailers realize that someone cares, especially that people all around the world care. So that's important. But Vladimir is able to continue his work, which is remarkable. And like I said, from the prisoners I've had exchanges with in the past, it's very difficult to maintain that optimism and the willingness to fight when you're in that sort of environment. And so it's been truly impressive to see Vladimir do that in so many ways with his letter writing. But Vladimir has written repeatedly, both in what he's written to me as well as in his op-eds. I mean, the prisons are full of Russians who have taken a stand. And so this narrative that is out there, I have these frank conversations with my Ukrainian friends who don't want to believe it, that there are good Russians at this point, that there are Russians who are actually taking a stand. But the fact is that there are many people who have risked everything to take a very clear confrontational position towards the Kremlin and this war. We do some limited reporting still on the ground. You can see it in our interviews that we're able to film all across Russia. We make them available, some in English, on our website, on RFE's website. And it is still a minority who are brainwashed in those interviews. It's also a minority of those who are actually brave enough to look into the camera and say very clearly what they think about the war and about Putin. But what heartens me is there is a very large middle that haven't quite made up their minds. And it's sad, from my perspective, that they haven't been willing to take a stand yet. But I think, from my sense, it's only a matter of time until more of them shift in the right direction. And the key there is maintaining engagement with them, not writing them off, finding ways to reach them, which we're doing every day as we expand our programming, which we have to do in new ways because we've been kicked out, our websites have been blocked, we have to use VPNs, we have to go an extra mile to try to reach people on the ground. But we have seen very little evidence that Russians are shying away from truthful information. Quite to the contrary, despite the fact that we're blocked, our audiences right now are actually higher than they were before the war. And that is with the several steps that people have to take to actually get factual information. They're drawn to reporting about the war. They're drawn to reporting about what is happening to Ukrainian families, about what is going on in this conflict, because they know they're being deprived of that truthful information from state propaganda. And so we just need to remain committed to them and to continue that outreach despite the naysayers. And I think that, that certainly in my engagement with Vladimir was his message. I remember very vividly, we were the first foreign agent media. We were getting to a point where we were going to be fined, and I had this conversation with him, what should we do? He said, embrace it, embrace the label, embrace the fact that you're foreign agents, run with it, that will not deter the Russian people. And in many respects, I think he's been right, even with this horrible situation we've seen play out since February 24th.
So let me come back to you. The film, and we're here at the Reagan Institute, really underscored the importance of international support for dissidents, for political prisoners, and how important President Reagan's acknowledgement for Father Edelstein was. What kind of support for Russian political prisoners, what kind of support for Vladimir, for all these others whose stories are not as well known, what kind of support do they need from those outside of Russia, and how can we provide that support?
Well, I would say that the main thing that the international democratic community can do to support those Russians who continue protesting, those political prisoners in the Russian Federation, is to show them support and solidarity with them. This is what Natalia was talking about. They need to see that the struggle is seen and recognized. Because, you see, it is really hard to estimate the number of brainwashed people in Russia, or the number of people who have been scared into silence, the number of war supporters even. It is hard Because in a society that has no access to independent information, no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly, no freedom of association, no free and fair elections, no freedoms at all, and of course, no independent opinion polls, because those people who, let's take Levada, for example. The number they very often do not publish is the percentage of people who actually agreed to answer the question. So when they say that, let's say 70% of the Russian population supports the war, they mean out of those 3 to 5% of those who actually agreed to answer the question. And how many of those agreed to answer the question and said that they actually supported the war just to be left alone because they're too scared to say otherwise? So I think that that has to be taken into consideration when we think about Russian society. And another fact is that the Putin regime would not need to use mass repression and total censorship by declaring anything that has to do with anything living in the country as undesirable or foreign agent if it actually had the support of the population. Because imagine if you have like the support of the majority of the population, why would you need to use why would you need to recur to those repressive tactics? Against whom? If no one protests, who are you going to throw in prisons? Why are prisons full? It's because there are people who do protest and because the regime is trying to silence them, because they need for the world to think that the entire Russian population stands behind Putin and the war, because this is what the regime, this benefits the regime, for the entire Russian population to be seen as this big monolith. And in this situation, every single person who protests, who goes out in the street, and then ends up in a prison with a 10-year sentence, anyone who gets raped during arrest, as it happened a number of times now, anyone who ends up in a psychiatric prison, that person risks so much to say no to the regime. And I believe that the best support for this person would be to feel the solidarity of the world, to know that the world does not see the entire Russian people as a big monolith that stands behind Putin and his regime, to see that his struggle, his or her struggle, is recognized, is seen.
Absolutely, thank you. I want to bring in the audience in this conversation. Did you want to add a word, Natalia, to that? And then I'll take a few questions and we can cluster as well. So
I wanted to support, thank you, David. I wanted to support Evgenia, and with all these horrible things that Putin's Russia is doing at the moment, it's very unfortunate that it's not the only trendsetter in this world, and we know that, for 16 years now, there is this huge advance of autocracies and decline of freedoms in the world. And what they do, these dictatorships, their biggest weapons are propaganda and repressions, but also they have this dictatorship international club, they support each other. But there should be democracy international. We should, solidarity should be our biggest weapon. And I think it's very, very important for people like us, like Vladimir, like everybody, that we, pro-democracy Russians, always felt ourselves as a part of the democratic world. We shouldn't be judged on the basis of ethnicity or citizenship, but only on the basis of values. We are the first ones who were warning the world about the criminal and terrible and corrupt and murderous Putin's regime. But also, yes, we again always had shared these values, democratic values, and again, it's very important for Vladimir, for all of us to be recognized as a part of this.
Thank you, Natalia. We talk about this a lot at the endowment. Defeating autocracy, Inc., it takes solidarity among Democrats, networks with networks. Let's start. Let me take maybe 3 at a time if I can. Here, here, here. Please introduce yourself, Alessia.
My name is Alessia. I'm a program officer with the International Forum for Democratic Studies. So, first of all, I would like to express solidarity with the democratic movement of Russia. And I would like to bring up the political prisoners of Belarus. So currently in Belarus, there are over 1,400 political prisoners. The founder of the organization, Vesna, who document the human rights violations, is currently himself in prison, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate. I would like to say that I would like to quote one famous political prisoner from Belarus, Sergei Tikhanovsky, the husband of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who said that what people don't realize is that political prisoners are being slowly killed in prison. So in Ukraine, we see fast violence. In prisons, we see slow violence, where people are actually being killed through torture. For example, Maria Kolesnikova, who led the uprising against the Lukashenko regime in 2020, in December of last year ended up in ICU unit, nearly in critical condition. She almost died because of medical mistreatment. She was denied medical care. She was put in solitary confinement. So I think that's something important to realize, that we need to pay attention to violence in prisons. It's a different kind of violence, but it's still violence.
And Alessia, a question for the team?
Yes. So one more thing. Evgenia, I admire your courage to advocate for your husband. I'm very glad that you have the opportunity to do that. I see that Timothy Fry is here. I'd like to mention that Igor Losik, a journalist of Radio Free Europe, is in prison in Belarus right now. His wife, Daria Losik, was put in prison for advocating for her husband. So we need to understand the great lengths to which these regimes will go to silence people who even advocate for their families. So I want to ask you just when you think the democratic movement will take off, when you think there might be opportunity for real profound change in Russia, because as long as there is a shadow of authoritarian Russia over the region, I don't think that people of Belarus can expect freedom. Political prisoners of Belarus cannot expect freedom. Obviously, political prisoners in Russia cannot expect freedom.
Maybe pass the mic down just a couple to your colleague here.
Gregory Pfeiffer, Director of the Institute of Current World Affairs. Thank you for this terrific screening of this important film and this terrific, important discussion. Of the many brilliant words of Vladimir's, what struck me today is his saying that next time we've got to get this right in Russia. And I remember very well in the 1990s taking part in graduate seminars on Russian politics, discussions about how really Russia was going to become a democracy, that the Soviet Union was a ruin. And I would spend summers in Moscow trying to find work as a journalist, and it was very clear that a lot of this wasn't passed, that it was a place that was incredibly corrupt, that there were client-patron relationships from the Soviet system still in existence. But yet in these seminars and all over the place, there was very little talk about this, very little acknowledgement about this. And so I see sort of a mirror of this right now with the points that you've been raising about how Russian society is treated as past it, as sick. Russians are subhuman. And I understand the motivations for this, of course, given what the Kremlin is doing in Ukraine and in Russia and elsewhere. But I wanted to ask, how much of a challenge is this for you, Evgenia, and you, Natalia, working as activists, trying to get information out and information in to Russia, and you, Jamie, as well, as overseeing an organization that is providing reporting that is incredibly rare now out of Russia. How much of this is a challenge? I know Vladimir used to say all the time, you've got to divide between the Russian people, and the Kremlin. I just wanted to ask how your feelings about this now and how much of a challenge it is. Thank you.
Let me take the third question right here. Just pass it forward to this gentleman. Thank you. Thank you. Then we'll come
Thank
back
you very
and
much.
come back
I'm Harley Balzer from Georgetown University, and I was kind of depressed this morning to look at my computer screen and see the New York Times saying that the sanctions haven't really done much. Somebody from Carnegie saying that the Russians love the war. What I'm seeing in the Russian press is that at least 40% of Russians said they would not go to fight in Ukraine under any circumstances, no matter what. And that's probably a low number for how many feel that way, given that before the war they were getting maybe 8 to 12% responding to questions. Now they're getting under 6. So you're right about who won't answer the questions. The Russian Union of Entrepreneurs and Industrialists says that import substitution for any major products like machine building or computer chips is right where it was in 2013. It has not budged in a decade of spending 4 or 5 trillion rubles to develop it. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how information like that gets out into the public consciousness a little more than it has been. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. Good questions. Why don't we come back? Why don't we start, Natalia and Evgenia and Jamie and Andrew, if you want to join in.
Yes, Gregory, thank you so much for your question. It's actually very, very hard to just find a better angel of our nature inside ourselves and get up and start and continue fighting with this evil empire every day. But again, because of our small worlds, because of people like Danik and Sonia and Katya and my son and everybody else, we do that. It's very stressful, very dangerous, very terrible right now to be Ukrainian, but at the same time, I can understand how it's proud to be Ukrainian, how inspired you are to defend your own country, your freedom, your independence, and how very, very demoralizing and hard to be a pro-democracy Russian now, and feel all this huge burden, huge responsibility that we need to straighten things up. So it's very, very hard for us to do that. But we want to be proud of our country so that, again, our children are proud of it, so that my personal goal is that Russia is a very, very boring country and there are no big news out of that. It will be the best achievement ever. Long way, because again, as I said, the biggest battlefield for us will be for values of our society, huge propaganda impact, but it's possible. People, we still see a lot of hopes, again, working with real people, with all these grassroots movements and so on, but also we see how people are tired of propaganda. We see 25-30% last year people outflow from official television. It's a huge, very positive sign. People do need access to alternative information, to independent media, to all this. So again, all these programs are very, very, very important. Difficult to do that. Please read our latest report that sanctions are working now. Another Vice President, Vladimir Milov, just recently published that. Right. It's really terrific thing. The main thing is great sanction regime, but this year should be the year of implementation, of enforcement. Again, Russia do find different alternative routes, but it's very possible to just stop that.
Vladimir Milov's report is a good source for this. Do you want to add to this, Evgenia? Vladimir's point on how do we get it right this time?
Yeah.
Next time.
I will start with the first question, I think, because I have Belarusian friends and my heart aches for them, and I know exactly what you're talking about. Because when I think about it, I see Vladimir Putin's regime as this big cancer tumor sitting in the middle of it all. And it spread, it metastasized in all directions. And so all other smaller dictatorships in that region, they depend on him. So if Putin's regime collapsed, I'm sure that it would lead to the crumbling of all other dictatorships around him. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And the fact is, the only way for Russia to be at peace with itself and its neighbors is for it to become a democracy. That is the only way. It is impossible to surround a country as big as Russia by an invisible fence, iron fence, and let it simmer in there, because it will implode and it will be much, much worse than what we're witnessing, the catastrophe that we're witnessing today. So I believe that the only way to have a change in that region is to push for the collapse of the Putin regime and make sure that Russia can no longer, never again, go back to becoming an authoritarian or a totalitarian country. Now, how do we make it right this time? And of course, I'm not a politician. Vladimir is. And he would give you an excellent program right now, just on the spot. He would come up with the most important things to carry out. I'm not a politician, so like Natalia, I want to see Russia a very boring democratic country where parliament discusses matters of budget instead of nuclear attacks against our closest neighbors. But one thing I can say is that I do, as a Russian citizen who lived through the 1990s, I do understand what was maybe the biggest mistake made in the early 1990s. There was no reckoning with the past. The Soviet Union collapsed, and now we understand that it didn't collapse entirely. Something was left, and it grew and grew and grew, and then we had Vladimir Putin. There was no reckoning with the past. There were no lustrations. There were no public trials. There were no, archives were opened for a very short period. Whoever was interested ran to look for information, and then they were closed again. That can never happen again. This is why I'm calling for the creation of an international tribunal to bring to responsibility all those responsible for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, for war crimes committed in Ukraine, and for all the crimes that have been committed by the regime against Russians for 23 years of the Putin regime. This is why I believe that lustrations will be needed. Public trials have to be as public as possible. Yes, a big part of the Russian society has been brainwashed by propaganda. And we need to understand that Vladimir Putin knew what he was doing. He came to power, and he began by closing one independent TV channel after another. By 2003, all independent TV channels were closed down in Russia. So that's 19 years of propaganda. So yes, the Russian society, well, yeah, there were other outlets that people could look for, but the majority of the Russian population relies on TV as the main source of information. And that is the message they've been hearing since 2003, and that was increasing in aggression. The message that Russia is this big empire, big, great country surrounded by enemies. Everyone out there wants to see Russia on its knees. Everyone out there wants to see Russia's demise. We need to stand up and fight, otherwise we'll be squashed. So in order to get to that part of the population and in order for that part of the population to convalesce, we need to turn off propaganda. And that we will only be able to do when the regime collapses, because now they have complete control over the media in the country. So yes, turning off propaganda, putting people in front of their TVs and show them the trials. Show them, carry out lustrations. Yes, carry out lustrations. Show to them what they were complicit in by staying silent, but not being able to process information, but not looking for better sources of information. I believe that is what will maybe make it right. But Vladimir would give you a more profound program.
I'm not sure about that. You nailed it. Gina, this is a great place. We're getting close to the witching hour. Jamie, Andrew, did you want to quickly just respond to this point?
The only thing I would say is I completely agree that this was slow and methodical on the part of Putin, and we lived that personally at Radio Free Europe. We were invited in by Yeltsin in '91. He famously said, "We no longer distrust you." Invited us to open a bureau, but 10 years later, 9 years or so later, as Putin took power, he immediately began to undo even that, moment of opening that we had, repealing the presidential order that actually invited Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty into Moscow, and then 20 years later, leading to the point where we were shut down. But it was done slowly along the way, and I think far too many people didn't realize what the ultimate goal was, and that Putin wanted to get to that point when, if he needed, because of concerns about regime instability, or if he knew he was going to do something controversial where he would lose the public, it was a very small step at that final stage to really start blocking websites, ban independent media, so it was very, very methodical. The one final thing I'll just say about Belarus is what I worry about is how things could get worse, actually, in Russia. Because if you look at what's happening right now in Belarus, it is fundamentally worse. We have 2 of our journalists in prison. It is illegal for anyone to even consume our information inside Belarus. We've had our audience go to prison for visiting our website. Thankfully, we haven't gotten to that point yet in Russia, but I think it's something we all need to be worried about, because if Putin feels insecure, if he feels like he's losing that control, he may try to actually learn some lessons from Lukashenko, who in the past has learned from him. And so I think it is something that we need to watch and figure out ways how we can still reach the Belarusian people who have even fewer options right now than the Russian people.
Thanks,
Jane. Great, can I just add a very good colleague who works with the Belarusian opposition said something that I took to heart, and I thought, oh my God, this is such an amazing metaphor. He said that in working with Belarusian opposition, they no longer build bridges, they dig tunnels. And I believe that this is exactly what we will be doing with Russian pro-democracy Russians inside of the country. We're now digging tunnels.
Andrew, come to you with a final word. Okay, I'm gonna wrap us. I'm gonna wrap us just so that we can continue the conversation with our colleagues over the reception. We were here to watch a pretty extraordinary documentary and remember Vladimir's case. Vladimir is in prison for speaking out and telling the truth. And part of what we're talking about is the historic amnesia, not acknowledging the truth. The impact of the Russian war in Ukraine and how that is remembered, how that is understood, the impact it has in Russia will be profound to whether Russia can develop as a free democratic country or not. It's Vladimir Putin's manipulation of the history. So I'm going to close with a quote from Father Edelstein. When Russian forces invaded Ukraine, he said to his congregation, early in the morning of February 24th, Russian troops invaded Ukraine. Period. Clear. Kyiv, Odessa, Kharkiv, Mariupol, and other Ukrainian cities are being shelled, he told his congregation. Russian soldiers kill their brothers and sisters in Christ. We cannot shyly close our eyes and call black white, evil good, and say that Abel was probably wrong and provoked his older brother. The blood of the people of Ukraine will remain on the hands of not only the rulers and soldiers who carry out the orders, their blood is on the hands of each of us who approved of this military operation or simply remained silent. The power of that truth is the essence of where a free democratic Russia can emerge. We thank Father Edelstein for his moral integrity. We are inspired by your husband's extraordinary continuation of this tradition. We wish him, we're praying for him and so many other Russians that are fighting for a democratic future. I want to thank you all for being with us. Thank you for honoring Father Edelstein and Vladimir. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our formal programming. Please proceed to the Legacy Hall for the cocktail reception. Thank you.